My name is Heather Nicol. I'm the director of the School for Study of Canada, Trent University, and that's in Peterborough, which is just outside Toronto. I'm here today to talk about the Antarctic and Arctic, and I'm really interested in lessons learned from the Arctic Council and whether or not that can be applied to the Antarctic, or whether there are lessons from the Antarctic and the Antarctic Treaty System that can be applied to the governance of the circumpolar North and could be picked up by the Arctic Council. There's many ways in which the Arctic Council and governance in the North is very, very different from governments in the Antarctic area. And that's not surprising given the difference in environment, given the difference in populations and activities, and in fact, given the different ways in which either of the poles, either the North or the South Pole, figure into the global international system. So it's interesting to look at the Arctic Council, Intergovernmental Forum, working with 8 Arctic states, and look at what they've accomplished over the last few decades, and then think about what the Antarctic Treaty System and the Madrid Protocol has also accomplished in a roughly comparable period of time. I don't know if there are lessons to be learned or not, but that's certainly something I'm interested in pursuing in the future. The key points of my talk are that many people think that the Arctic should adopt a system of governance more like the Antarctic and the Antarctic Treaty System. The problem is that the situation is so different in the North with the different nation states and indigenous peoples organizations and different geopolitics and different interests. The North is an ocean, the Arctic Ocean, surrounded by land, Canada, Russia, US, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and Denmark because of Greenland. Whereas the Antarctic is a continent surrounded by an ocean. So those differences translate into different problems and different issues, and yet you've got a very similar polar environment. So I would think that there are some ways in which the governance of the North, and particularly in its cultivation of sort of a political agreements and political glue that holds the cooperation among northern nations, I think that could be something that would be really interesting to cultivate among those consultative and non-consultative nations that are party to the Antarctic Treaty System. On the other hand, I think that the kinds of binding agreements that tie together the Antarctic Treaty System could be useful in the North, but not as useful because there are so many differences of opinions between nation states who actually have people and territory within the region in ways that the Antarctic continent does not. But the other issue is how in the future is the Antarctic Treaty System going to hold up? Are there lessons from the Arctic Council? Is there that political glue that the Arctic Council has developed to basically around environmental issues? But could that be broadened to help overcome some of the new geopolitical tensions? That's certainly happening in the Arctic. Now, could that kind of system and cooperation be developed in the Antarctic in ways that would help would help mitigate against some of the potential tensions surrounding China's role in the region, surrounding what will happen if the Madrid Protocol is revisited in 2048? What will happen if there's a decision or there's a change the way in which territorial claims and claimant states, in terms of the territory they hold or their relationship to each other? So it's a question of thinking about the future and what might be resilient politically, what might be resilient in terms of cooperation, and what are some of the lessons learned from each organization, and could they be useful to each other? So 3 key strategic issues would be climate change, would be changing geopolitical tensions, and also in terms of the circumpolar North, the relationship between indigenous and non-indigenous communities. Climate change, because of course it's changing rapidly, more rapidly in the circumpolar North than the circumpolar South, but it still will be an issue in the Antarctic within the next 50 to 100 years. Geopolitical change and tension because of the different ways in which the opening up of particularly the Arctic through global climate change is making more sea routes and resources accessible, and that different nations, particularly some of the observer states like China, are much more interested now in accessing those resources, and that has creates potential tensions for Arctic nations. But also in the Antarctic area, China's role is in the Antarctic is increasingly being met with some suspicion as to the relationship between military and non-military use of their base areas and research stations, or research projects, I should say. And then the third issue is the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, which is more of an issue in a sense in North America, although that's not, it's not the case that there are not significant numbers of Indigenous peoples throughout the circumpolar region, Russia and the Nordics, Nordic countries as well. Not so much an issue in the Antarctica, because of course there are no Indigenous populations. But the movement in the North is towards more accommodation of Indigenous populations and of reconciling differences in governance and culture, and of course in understanding the important role that traditional knowledge has to play as we watch climate change and as we try to understand and anticipate what's going to happen. Indigenous peoples generally have a much more fine-tuned sense of and a much more intimate relationship to the land, and understand climate change in ways that we sometimes have missed. Some of the key priorities, absolutely, education is an absolute priority, but education in terms of trying to get more experiential learning in the North and in the South Pole, in Antarctica as well. People really can't understand, they can't shape policy, they can't deal with, make decisions about climate change or even anticipate future changes without really having some experience of these regions. So I think education and experiential learning is a real priority, and that's a difficult one because of the distance and the remoteness of the polar regions. I also think that, the encouraging the blending of traditional and the role of traditional knowledge with non-traditional modes of education is extremely important. It's not only important in delivering education in circumpolar North, but it's also important for people outside of the North to understand and be educated about the region in different ways that really acknowledge and promote understanding of the region's Indigenous peoples. Again, that's a circumpolar North rather than an Antarctic perspective. But I think that those are certainly the two key areas that we should focus on. Science, again, is another area, polar science, and under developing capacity and technology to adapt to climate change, because that again is happening rapidly, and it's happening now to communities in the North, and there has to be some way to better prepare communities and to better equip communities to deal with climate change.